Michelle, thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Starting Over with Shannon. I'm very pleased to have you. And I stumbled across you through one of your guided breathwork meditations on YouTube, which is quite popular. So I think that's an entry point for a lot of people to you and your work. But something that really stood out to me and resonated with me, quite honestly, was often the gentle approach that I think you have to breathwork and emotional healing and building self-awareness, because breathwork has been dubbed the new yoga. I'm not sure what you can give me your take on that. It's obviously gaining in popularity, as are all of these bodywork practices for emotional spiritual healing, self-development. But I find that there is quite a strong undercurrent of like, be tough, mental toughness. Let's use breathing patterns to achieve peak performance and be our best selves. And maybe that works for some people, but I know, being of the more sensitive inclination, as I suppose a lot of my audience probably are as well, that doesn't quite sit. So I'm happy you're here with your sensitivity and different approach to breathwork. So thanks so much, Michelle.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks for having me.
So, where I want to start is where I start with all of my guests, actually, and it's the ways in which they have experienced a starting over in their life. And that can be something that's hit them sideways that they didn't expect, whether that be a loss or an end of a relationship, or something that's led them to an opening also to spirituality that they might not have had before. So, can you walk us through a time in your life that was really, let's say, a rock bottom moment that catalyzed your journey inward?
Yeah, I've had a couple of them. I think the biggest one happened in 2016. I call it now a dark night of the soul. At the time, I was calling it a blindsiding breakup. And I think the blindsiding breakup catalyzed that dark night of the soul. I had already been practicing breath work. So I had already had kind of another awakening experience, maybe 3 or 4 years prior to that, when I had first found breath work. And that was already starting to change my life. But I was still holding on to using other people's love to fill me up unconsciously. So I was in a relationship with somebody, and I think also because I was already doing healing work, I was already doing breath work, I was facilitating breath work. I was sort of in this position of being able to sort of mask and hide some of the parts of myself that I wasn't ready to look at. And I was totally unconscious that I was doing that. And then I went through a blindsiding breakup. The relationship ended very abruptly. We were very happy. And then suddenly it was over. And so that catalyzed this dark night of the soul where I feel like it's kind of like the universe pulling the rug out from under me and being like, that's not the direction that you're meant to be going. You're meant to be going this direction. And that direction was inward into myself. And during that period of time, I mean, not only was I grieving the loss of the relationship, but I was deeply, deeply depressed. I felt completely lost. I was like incredibly unable to really do anything, like non functioning. And I had experienced depression before in my life. I had experienced a lot of depression before in my life, but never to this degree. I'd never experienced this level of heartbreak before. Everything was just way more intense. And that experience, I couldn't escape it. I tried almost anything I could do to run from it and for it to be better. And I'd gone through different breakups before. And, being a deeply feeling person, like anytime I went through a breakup, it was hard. But this was a whole other level. And I sort of expected it to pass in the ways that the others had, and it didn't.
Mm.
And so I knew that there was nothing that I could do but confront what was within me. And I had a lot of suffering that I experienced because I was trying to resist my pain for a really long period of time. I mean, this went on for many months. And through that process, I would start to, I was already doing breath work. So I had that as a tool. But really within myself, I was like, not really wanting to see some of the things that were showing up for me, which was like all inner child healing. It was like all of the self-worth wounds, all the ways I didn't love myself, all of the ways that I held shame and guilt and felt like I was not who I was supposed to be, were all coming to the surface. It was very overwhelming period of time. But thankfully, I had already had this tool, which was the breath, to support me in going inward. And I had some, I had my mentor and things like that as well.
What do you think made it more intense for you this time round?
That's a really good question. I think probably I was at a place on my spiritual journey where I had enough foundation to know that I could get through things. I don't think that I fully believed that I could get through anything until after I'd gone through that experience. But it was kind of like, I believe in soul contracts and that we sign up for certain lessons in our lifetimes. And it was like all the stuff that I was avoiding looking at was like, no, you don't just get to be in like a comfy relationship. Like, that's not just what you're here to do. You're actually here to learn, about love and about pain and about, the human condition. And so it felt to me almost like the floodgates opened and everything that had been repressed, specifically a lot of grief that I was holding from my lineage as well, just came kind of like rushing up to the surface. And, some of this I think is like divine timing. Like, it was just the right time in my life for me to reckon with what I was carrying in my body.
So do you think, I hear this in at least spiritual dialogue, the idea that life doesn't give you a challenge that you can't handle, and that there is a timing aspect to what you go through, and that you are supported and you have the resources you need in order to get through it. But what actually, I'm curious, because for me, when I started opening up to this, there was a period of time in my life where I wanted to cultivate more spirituality, and that helped me to have trust in the unknown. It was a time when I could have had a lot of fear around how my life was unfolding. And yet there's still that part of me, the kind of egoic part that wants to rationalize or think, well, I don't have an explanation for this. I don't know how to explain it. Therefore, can I just assume I believe this? Did you ever have that part of your journey where you started questioning, like, okay, is this what I actually believe? How do I know that this is what I believe? Did you go through that?
Yeah, I think, well, I've tended to be a very like hard-headed person and always had a very clear idea of like what I wanted and the direction I wanted my life to go. So more in that regard, I really fought my experience because I was like, no, I want to do this. I want my life to go this way. Even when I wrote my first book, I wrote it about this dark night of the soul. Like, I didn't want to write that book. I didn't want to write this book that was like all vulnerable. I wanted to write about the things that I knew. And so I was really in a place of like needing to surrender to what was arising in the moment. And that was a huge, I fought it a lot. And I really have learned that lesson in a lot of different ways in my life. But I think I also, the resistance that would come up, I really needed to learn about that as well. And that has also helped me support other people. The deeper spiritual thing, I think, is that I always felt like there was something that was holding me, but I didn't feel a real personal connection to it. So I would call it spirit now, universe, whatever you want to call it. I was born and raised Catholic, and that never particularly resonated with me, but I always felt like there was something. So I would have considered myself to be a seeker. The breath actually supported me in feeling that connection. So I had already really developed this spiritual relationship for a couple of years, but I would say it wasn't strong enough to like move me through that period of time with like unwavering faith. I for sure, doubted. I questioned, like, why am I experiencing this? Like, it almost felt like I shouldn't be experiencing this since I already had a spiritual practice and I was already practicing this work. And I was already like this whole idea that I had that I was like already somewhere that I was supposed to be or that I wanted to be. And really it was like surrendering to like, there's a greater vision and perspective here, a greater part of myself that actually was directing me. And I had to kind of like surrender the ego over and over and over again to listen to that part of myself.
How did you actually do that? This is so relevant. I talk a lot about letting go. And then when it actually comes to the how of how to do it, it is so difficult, actually. And I think also individualized. I think there's not necessarily one approach. I think this is why it's often called the art of letting go. You know, it's not a scientific formula based on rational analysis and logic. It's like there seems to be this subjective, personalized journey that people take that isn't so prescriptive. I don't know. Was that your experience a little?
I think, yeah, I think life, right, is very unique to each person, and all of our experiences that we come across. There's not one way to do anything. There's the way that works for us, and then we share it with other people, and some people resonate with it and some people don't. I think that's
That's
kind of
it.
the beauty, the human experience. But I would say that for me, I think one of the biggest things I learned about letting go was that my idea of letting go really was about, I don't want to feel this. I don't want to feel this and I don't want to be with this. And so I just want to let it go. And that is like a pushing away of actually what needs to be, what just needs to be, what needs to be sat with, what needs to be felt, what needs to be integrated. Whatever is left over from that integration can be released. But I actually had to learn that the letting go is more about pulling in the parts of myself that I wanted to push away actually supported me in being able to let go of whatever else was there that wasn't actually what was needed anymore. It's like you can't let go of something that you have. If there's a lesson there to be learned and you're like trying to push away all the stuff that doesn't feel good, you don't really get to learn the lesson. So you have to pull it towards you, feel it, be with it, process it. And then when it's time, it will release on its own.
Yeah, and I get the impression it's much more of like a wither away because
Yeah.
there's a force that comes with. That's a great point. I'd never heard of that before, in the sense of like bring it in, pull it closer. Even though there's obviously this dialogue around like you've got to feel it to heal it. You know, we need to experience our emotions and so on. But yeah, hearing that in that way is different. Let's break down what this dark night of the soul is for some people who might be like, I have no idea what that means. Does that just mean that like shit hit the fan, tough times got really tough and you were at night in the dark and it was terrible? What is it?
Yeah, I think it was coined, was it John of the Cross? It's like an old term. But to me, the way that it showed up for me was like a collapse of my life as I knew it. It was like the way that I was operating, the person that I viewed myself as needed to completely just sort of crumble. I mean, that's the way it felt to me. I felt like my whole life was just like crumbling and falling to pieces. I felt like completely lost, completely ungrounded, completely disoriented, not sure how to move forward. I would describe it as like, I think I wrote about in my book as like being like driven on a bus to like the desert and dropped off, and like everything is foggy and you can't see anything. There's no signs anywhere. And you're just like, what do I do? You know, that was what it was for me. It was just like, life is completely transforming. This isn't going to continue on the way that you wanted it to continue on. And I did everything I could to try to like hold on to it. But it was like, it's like holding on to the sand, It's just like there was nothing to hold on to. Nothing was left.
Yes. I think, I mean, it can sound pretty abstract, I guess, for somebody who might not be familiar with it, because, we talk about these rock bottom moments and it's often expressed as like deep depression, people have intrusive suicidal thoughts that might accompany it. But I think the key piece that you're mentioning here is a collapse of all the meaning in your life, and you're deconstructing your beliefs and your identity of who you are, who you thought you were, how you thought your life was going to go. So it's much more of the existential crisis where everything is called into questions and where you don't feel like you have the answers. And I think what can be so difficult about this is because you're entirely stuck in limbo. It feels like how you're saying about being stuck in the desert. It's like you don't know how to proceed, and it feels like while there could be a wealth of options in reality, I mean, that's also the beauty of it. It can also be overwhelming and terrifying. Of like, wow, all of a sudden, if I thought I was on this track and that's not happening anymore, what could I do? Who am I?
Especially when you don't feel good. Right. So it's like, it's true that when we're in the void, there's like unlimited, we could go anywhere from that place. But first, it requires grappling with all of the pain that we're being confronted with. I think that's one of the biggest things that sort of marks a dark night of a soul. It's very, very, very painful beyond anything we typically experience. Like, if you hear that somebody goes through heartbreak or they go through a breakup, that's one experience. But a dark night of the soul is like losing yourself, right? It's not just you lose a person, you become completely lost. So it's like greater than all of the normal challenges that we experience in our lives. Grappling with that first, making sense of that. We can't move forward before we do that.
Yeah. So how did it feel for you in terms of the rebuilding or the rebirthing or the steps you took from there?
Very slow, very, very slow. And I am a person who tends to move very quickly. So I was very impatient with the fact that the process wasn't moving faster, even though I was like very much doing the work, showing up and doing breath work every day, deeply processing everything that was coming up for me, writing a book about the experience. Like I was, doing the things that I felt like I needed to do, and still I was in overwhelming pain. And so all I could do was like keep on staying with myself, continue to put one foot in front of the other. Like for a very long time, it was just like, being with myself. I didn't even feel like I lived in Los Angeles at the time, and like I love the sun. And like the sun being out didn't even feel like anything to me. People who've experienced depression can understand that kind of experience. And then I remember having a period of time where I woke up one morning and I felt like a little bit better. And when you feel like a tiny bit better when you're in that type of a depression, it feels like everything. And then I remember being like, oh my gosh, I'm going to move forward. Like, this is it. I'm coming out of this. And the next day it felt worse. Like it felt like I had almost like kind of regressed. And I had a very big breakthrough moment that day of recognizing that I was contributing to my own suffering because I was resisting what was. Like I went to the laundromat and I was like sitting there just like watching the clothes spinning. And at the time, what was happening for me was that so much of the repressed grief that was living in my body through my whole life, and then probably a lot, like I was saying before, through my lineage, was rising to the surface to be cleared. Because when you go through a dark night of the soul, like I was saying, it's like there's no more barriers. Like the identity is kind of gone. And so there was nothing in me like able to hold anything down. So it almost kind of felt like the grief would rise up to the top to my eyes and then spill out and then, happen over and over again. And it was but overwhelming grief. So being in a public place, experiencing that was not really ideal. So I remember like running home to get home so I could just like let out the sobbing. And I got inside and I did. And it was like just some wisdom emerged within me that was like, just surrender. And I could feel in my body again, it's like a concept, right? Like, what does that actually mean? I got the message in my body of what that meant. And it meant just to like let everything arise and move and just be the vessel and observe it and like offer myself love and compassion through the process. So I started just doing that. That was like a big turning point for me of like not fighting the sadness anymore, not like trying to avoid it or calling a friend and, like talking about my problems or talking about how I was feeling. Like I let myself go deep, deep, deep into the feelings. And I did that over and over and over and over and over again until, gradually my life started to change.
Yeah. And where did you go from there? What did change for you?
Everything. I mean, like completely everything. It was set like 7 years ago now. So when I look back at that period of time, I feel so much wiser. The biggest thing I think that happened was I got to know all the parts of myself. I healed, so many aspects of the inner child, the parts of me that I had locked away and avoided because I believed that, they weren't going to get me love. And I really learned what it meant to love myself. Like my heart opened in a way that I'd never experienced before. Like I loved people before that. And I feel like I thought that I loved myself, but my heart opened to have so much compassion for humanity through that experience because I was holding the depth of all of the pain that I don't even know how much of it, it could have been from, lifetimes and many different people in my lineage and my parents and, all of the experiences I had in my life. They're human experiences. The feelings are all human feelings. So I think it like really supported my work. I was already facilitating healing for people before then, but I think it gave me a whole new level of compassion and understanding for what people go through and what they're holding, and also knowing the art of how to allow those emotions to release and the fear that can show up and all of the ways that we block ourselves from being with it. Like being able to really know and hold somebody in that experience while they do that for themselves is incredibly, healing. So I think my work changed a lot, but everything about me and the way that I see life and all the wisdom, I gained so much wisdom through processing all of those feelings and like letting my rage come to the surface, where now there's nothing within me that I'm afraid of. Like I'm never afraid to go inward. I have no resistance to doing breath work. I still have things show up in my life, but it's the way that I now relate to those obstacles is like with a lot more grace and a lot more patience.
How do you see the obstacles that you face?
To me, everything is happening for a reason, and it's showing me something. I think a lot of times it's showing what's in the subconscious that we're not actually aware of. Like again, it can be really easy to live like 5% of our mind is actually operating from the conscious level. And it
Yes.
feels like it's everything, And so it can seem like, oh, I've got everything under control when things are going well in my life. And then when something happens, as it inevitably does, it's pointing us to, to me, it's pointing me to something that needs my attention that I wasn't aware of before. So I just like to look at it. It's kind of like an investigation. Doesn't always feel good, and sometimes it can feel like it's like derailing you and it can be frustrating. But I think that like one of my life lessons is like learning how to have more and more patience. So every time something comes up, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to like try to let it show me through my life the way it needs to, rather than me trying to force it and find because a lot of times when I try to do that, like figure out the thing so I can move on, it's like I'm sort of avoiding being with something.
Yes.
So the more that I let it unfold within me as it needs to, like I'm really able to learn and integrate the lesson more easily.
Yeah, I see that. And I love that you're mentioning all these points about resistance and holding space, and because it is something that comes up for everyone to differing degrees, of course, but I think we'll all have ways in which we resist looking deeply at ourselves. And I guess as a breathwork facilitator, you see that a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's go into a little bit about breathwork, what got you into it and why you think it is useful as a healing modality.
I've been practicing breathwork for 10 years now, so it's been a long time. Back when I found out about it, nobody I knew was practicing it. It was actually very difficult to find anybody who was facilitating it. And I chronically grind my teeth while I'm sleeping. It's still something that I'm working on healing. And I've been doing it since I was very, very young. And at the time it was like 2013, I had been grinding my teeth very badly and had like pinched nerves and like just a lot of pain in my neck. So I was very broke at the time. I was looking for somebody just to like do one session and like heal me and relieve me of my pain essentially. And so I had found an Ayurvedic healer, tried to book a session with him, and we were going back and forth. And then he was like, we had the session almost booked. And then he was like, I can't actually work with you. I can't support you. I think you should do breath work. And I was like, what? At the time, I was very controlling. I had boundary issues. There was like a lot of stuff that was going on with me. And I was like, why? Like, why won't you work with me? I wanted it to be the way I wanted it to be. And he actually wrote me a really beautiful email back because I asked, why. I knew he saw something in me that I hadn't seen in myself, or I didn't know was arising within me. And he told me that, yeah, I had control issues and trust issues. And he basically was like, some herbs are not going to really help you. Like you need to actually do something that's much deeper on a cellular level. I think you should do breath work. And because
I mean, credit to him for saying that.
Totally. Well, and I had asked him, so he was like, "Okay, since you're asking, here you go." And I'm so glad that I did, because I actually went into the bathroom, I got in the shower, and I started crying after he wrote me that email. And it was a big realization for me, because I realized that I hadn't cried in years. And so these like kind of pieces were starting to arise for me, where I was like, okay, like I know that I'm a very deep feeling person, and I haven't felt sadness in years. And my grandmother had just died previously, and I remember seeing like my brothers crying, and they're not, they weren't as emotional as me. So I was like, I knew that something was
Blocked.
like clogged,
Yeah.
essentially. Yeah, blocked. And so everything he said really rang true. And I was like, all right, I'll just try it. I'll try breath work. And I really thought it was like going to be a very kind of soothing, relaxing experience. When I thought of breath work at the time, I thought of like monks sitting and breathing, and it being just like a very kind of chill experience. And this type of breath work isn't, it can be a lot more intense, especially if you have a lot of control stuff, a lot of emotion that's been repressed in the body. So I went and did a session, and to me, like everybody's experience is different. Some people do one breathwork session and, everything opens up, their heart opens, and they start releasing all this emotion. I was very tightly wound. I was not very trusting. I wasn't working with my teacher at the time, but I probably wasn't working with the right facilitator either. It was very matched up for where I was at that time in my life. So I was doing it for a little bit, but I started to notice like that I sort of felt like I was thawing. It was like, I was softening a little bit. And that was like the first thing I was like, this feels good. Nobody at the time, and this teacher in particular, didn't really tell me what was happening. Like, I didn't really know what I was doing. I just kind of went in, laid on a table, and started breathing. I was like, okay, I feel like a little bit like lightheaded. I'm starting to feel some energy in my body, but I always felt better. Like, I just knew I always felt better. And then I just kind of, it fizzled for a little bit, for a couple of months, and I went through a different breakup and was pretty depressed. And then, a friend of mine I decided to share with her that I had done breath work. And she was like, oh, like somebody took me to this Pilates studio, and in the back of the room, like we did breath work. And she gave me this person's information. And I went there and I started to practice again. And then I ended up from there, like finding my teacher and working with him more consistently.
Yeah. So let's go into more the specifics of what kind of technique you use and why, and what a session actually looks like if somebody did it with a certified practitioner as opposed to just breathing themselves at home to relax a little bit.
Yeah. So I do think it's important to say that I know that breathwork is getting incredibly popular. And so there's all different types of breathing patterns. My lineage is through my teacher, David Elliott. He's been facilitating this work for about 30 years. And the breathing pattern is breathing in and out of the mouth for about like 90% of the time. At the very end, you breathe through the nose and just sort of relax, let everything integrate. But the first portion, we're breathing in and out of the mouth. We're breathing into the low belly, and then we inhale again into the heart, and then we release the breath. So the intention through breathing through the mouth, which, we're supposed to be really breathing through the nose as much as possible through our days. We're breathing intentionally through the mouth to create pressure and consciousness in the body, right? So we're breathing into the low belly, where energetically a lot of our repressed emotion lives. And then we're breathing it up into the heart to purify it with love and support the heart in opening. And then we let it go. So that's the breathing pattern that we use. And we typically breathe, depends on the person, but it's usually an active 30, 35 minutes. And then, just like resting and integrating for like 10, 15 minutes, depending on the person in the session.
See, I am curious about it through the mouth, because when I've followed this before, people will say we do like a conscious breathing pattern and it is intentionally through the mouth. But then I'm hearing more about the importance of breathing through our nose all day, when we're asleep, when we're working out. And it can feel really weird to breathe through your mouth. At least I don't know, maybe other people who've tried, you're like, okay, I've got a dry mouth. It makes my throat a little bit scratchy. I feel a bit unhealthy when I'm doing this.
Yeah, people have a lot of ideas about, I mean, and also depends on like how it feels to your body. I never had a feeling of it feeling off for me to be breathing through my mouth. I think in the very beginning, maybe my mouth got a little dry, and that's usually what people experience the most. So we just lick the lips and then swallow and just do the best that we can. Some people will start to breathe like kind of sucking the air in, and that can also make your mouth dry. So it's just like let your jaw hang loose, and the breath should actually feel really easy. We're breathing through the mouth again to really activate what's living in the body and to get out of our head. So if you're breathing through the nose, that typically brings more energy and awareness to your head, to your mind. And we actually want to let the mind go and drop down into the body. So James Nestor has a good book called Breathe. Yeah, and he talks a little bit about, he goes into like all the more technical stuff about breath work. And there's a section in there, I think, on rebirthing, but focusing more on conscious breathing and that, conscious breathing, we're breathing for 30 minutes in a day. Like that's going to be fine. The benefits to me outweigh any type of like potential biological negative repercussions through breathing through the mouth for 30 minutes.
Yeah. So, what are the benefits as you see? Perhaps you can tell a story about a client that you've worked with, and also what you do to guide people. Do you say something? Are they thinking about something, or how does it work?
So typically, the person should be lying down. And in my one-on-one sessions, we'll be talking for a while. So, sometimes I have recurring clients, but if it's a new client, I just want to get to know them and hear in their own words, like what's going on in their life, where they're feeling stuck in their life. Typically, people are booking a session for a particular reason, not just to like experience this thing that they've heard about. So we'll just like chat for like 30 minutes. And then I move them into the guided breathwork session. And so I have them lie down. Usually we'll have some oils that we'll put on to help kind of open up the energy in the body. But virtually, they'll just kind of lay down somewhere that's comfortable. And then I obviously teach them the breathing pattern, and then they start to breathe. And for me, I'm feeling into my intuition. I'm watching what's happening in the body, what I'm noticing, how their body is responding. And then I have them say certain things at certain times. We work with affirmations, and the affirmations are really powerful because about 7 or 8 minutes into active breathing in this way, the mind will typically start to release. And when the mind starts to let go, the heart begins to open. So we start to get more connection to the energy in our body. Our hearts are opening. We're also getting more access to the subconscious. In my sessions with my teacher, I remember, one of the first sessions I had with him, he had me put my hands over my heart and say, I'm worthy of love. If I had said I'm worthy of love sitting there, before I'd started breathing.
Like right now.
Right now, it would just be like, and now I actually feel that I'm worthy of love. But at the time I didn't. And because I was like in this deeper state of consciousness, it opened up this truth within me that I believed that I wasn't worthy of love. And
Yes.
affirming that I was worthy of love opened my heart to actually feel that love in myself. And then, this release of emotion arises in that recognition. And sometimes there'll be memories that come up. You might see yourself younger and having a moment in time where maybe you actually took on the belief that you were unworthy or whatever it is. A lot of times in the beginning of the sessions, we're working with fear because a lot of people's, fear of letting go. We were speaking about letting go before, feeling your feelings is very uncomfortable for a lot of people. And this feeling of having your mind start to turn off and feeling your energy in your body, feeling a spiritual connection, feeling your heart. Like a lot of us aren't deeply connected to love in the way that we might think that we are. And so feeling that can feel really overwhelming for some people. And so it's a lot of times this subconscious mechanism, that arises of like putting the brakes on. So sometimes it shows up in tightness of the hands because the energy of the heart moves down the arms and out the fingertips. And so a lot of times people will start to kind of clench up in an unconscious act of resistance to feeling love because we're afraid of it because we haven't felt it in a long time. So part of my job is to support people in opening at like the pace that's best for them. And it's like an art form, of just kind of like feeling into how to support each individual in opening in the way that's right for them.
I think without somebody actually doing it, it's so hard to connect with what you're saying. I know when I've done this and things have come up for me, I've absolutely felt the resistance, the fear of letting go and the rationalizing of like, what's happening in my brain right now? Am I starving myself of oxygen, or am I giving myself too oxygen, or what, and I can see that there's mental resistance to it that makes me want to snap out of it, when actually a lot of it is bodily resistance as well, of not wanting
Yeah.
to open up. And it's a common experience, isn't it?
Oh my God, totally. And this is, in the beginning of doing the work, I just met somebody the other day and they asked what I do for a living and I was sharing and they had experienced breathwork before and they described it as grueling. And it kind of made me laugh because that is not my experience anymore. But when I first started, it was, in the beginning when we haven't processed much of what's within us, when there's a lot of resistance to being with our traumas and our heartbreak and, our wounded selves, there is a lot of resistance. And so breathing in this way can feel grueling. It can feel like a lot of hard work. Consistency over time, that goes away. It's very normal for the mind to like analyze the experience and try to like, a lot of times at the beginning, people are like, am I doing it right? Am I doing
Of
it right? Am I
course.
breathing the right way? And like, we're observing our experience. We're observing what's happening in the body. When we experience a sensation that's unfamiliar to us, usually we get afraid. Is this okay? Is this safe? So a lot of the beginning part is affirming safety, and this is why to me, it's more important to go gently over time than it is to have these big, huge experiences at once. Like I would prefer people to do breath work, every day for 10 or 15 minutes rather than do an hour session once a month or something. It's going to be more supportive for that unraveling to happen like incrementally. And really, the process in the beginning is that we're teaching our bodies to feel safe feeling. And so we can kind of go up to where our edge is. And, in the beginning for me, my edge was it showed up pretty quickly. And we have to, again, this is about having patience because we live in a society that we want quick fixes. We don't really want to have to go through this like long-term process. But being somebody who's practiced breath work now for 10 years consistently, like it always supports me. Every single time I do a session, I come out of that session more connected to myself. So even in the beginning, when we are more oriented to the mind and we're not so connected to the heart or to the body, we may finish a session and not recognize what it's actually doing for us on our
Right.
journey. That's why I like, 30-day challenges and things like that in the beginning, because sometimes we have to keep putting in the time and the effort, consistently over time to start to see change, because change doesn't just happen immediately. It's a cumulative process.
So if somebody was thinking after this, okay, I want to start integrating breathwork as a more regular practice, not as this one-off emotional healing experience to release grief or something, what would you suggest is a good entry point?
So if you're doing it for the first time and it's an option for you to hire a facilitator, I always recommend that, because that's always the best way to get to feel safe going deep into it. And then you'll have that sort of template in your body. And when you go to breathe again on your own, the fear is typically not going to arise like the way it would if you were just laying down on your own. Once you're in the place where some people can just start to practice on their own and they're fine. And I did a lot of self-healing in the beginning of my journey, especially because I couldn't afford to work with practitioners very often. So what I would recommend is, it depends on your body. So if you have a lot of resistance coming up, meaning that like things lock up in your body, everything's getting kind of stiff and tight pretty quickly, a shorter 10-minute breathwork meditation daily is better, so that you can start to give your body the experience of safety and it'll start to feel familiar, where you can then start to breathe for longer periods of time. I have a kit called Getting Started with Breathwork, and there's 3 different meditation links in it. So it like supports people. Also, sometimes people are really busy and getting like 15 or 20 or 30 minutes in can feel like a lot. So having like that 10, 15 minutes can be helpful. And then you can start to work your way up. In that, I also have a little 30-day challenge. That's kind of like the best way for people to get started. If you're going to if you want to do it for free, I also have a free breathwork meditation on YouTube. I think that's the one you were talking about in the beginning of the introduction. And that one, I did that in 2018, so I don't know how long it is, but I think it's only about 15 minutes of active breathing, which can sometimes feel like too much for some people. So I would just say, like, listen to your body. And if you feel like you're hitting an edge, just breathe through your nose. Like, I think about breathing through the mouth is sort of like putting your foot on the gas. You're accelerating the energy connection in your body. So you're starting to feel the energy moving more intensely. It can feel intense for some people, especially in the beginning. So if it feels too intense, just breathe through the nose and just start to slow it down a little bit. You can always open your eyes, which starts to activate the mind. Speaking out loud also activates the mind. And the more the mind is active, the slower the energy is going to go. So it'll start to really slow everything down. And then just start to give yourself more and more experiences of experiencing what the breath feels like in your body.
And do you think over time it would build up someone's resilience to meeting their fear? Because I really am big on fear in the sense that there are so many ways that we are controlled by fear without knowing it. We all carry some form of fear and we resist feeling it hard. It is one of the main emotions, I'd say, that we really retreat from. The survival instinct is so strong. And yet we also know that it's one of the key emotions we really need to move through to live a better life. So with that in mind, what do you think that breathwork can possibly do when it comes to fear?
I mean, for me, I think it's been the greatest teacher in not allowing fear to rule my life, specifically because I think that a lot of the fear that shows up for us is in relationship to what life is activating within our own bodies. So if you're like being triggered by something, and the fear comes up, it's pointing you to what needs to be looked at within yourself. Typically, people tend to just focus on outside of themselves and not really address that. So the breath gives us the opportunity to actually be with what's underneath the fear. When we're allowing ourselves to sit with the fear and be present with it and love ourselves through it, there's something on the other side of that. And we get to the other side of that, and usually there's grief. A lot of people who experience anxiety, in my experience, when I work with people who are experiencing acute anxiety in the moment, they typically are pushing grief down. And so if I can work with them in the moment, I'll get them into the heart space, and then this like wells of grief will be clearing. And on the other side of it, there's no more anxiety. It's like that sensation in the body of like feeling too afraid to be with, our grief, especially when we're not super clear about why it's arising. If you're living a so-called happy life and you're having all this stuff coming up, or you believe that you're supposed to feel happy with your life and you really don't, there's so many reasons why we would be in resistance to feeling what is in the body. Using the breath gives us permission to go more deeply into it and to alchemize it. And when that happens, in my experience, there's less and less fear there. And then the times in our lives when the fear does show up, there's more ability to sit with it rather than react from it. So then we can like really, get clear about our decision making and not be reactionary from that fear-based place.
That is so fascinating that you've discovered grief being commonly underneath that fear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then that would manifest as people be bursting into tears and releasing in that way.
Session?
In the session, yeah.
Oh yeah, sobbing. So I mean, sobbing for sensitive people, and a lot of people don't know how sensitive they are. We're all sensitive beings. Some of us are way more sensitive than others. But a lot of us, like for me, I was not identified with being a sensitive person because I had kind of pushed all that down. So it took a long time for me to really recognize how sensitive I was. But for sensitive people, highly sensitive people, oftentimes using the breath is incredibly cathartic because it helps us release the layers and layers and layers of grief that we're holding in our bodies. I had no idea that I was carrying the amount of grief that I was carrying in my body.
And that was really an unexpected part for you then, the grief that came up, like that caught you sideways.
The amount of it, I had,
right.
After my dark night of the soul, there were a couple of years, and this is probably one of the most common questions I get from people who are like deeply immersed in the healing journey through using the breath as a tool of like, when is the sadness going to stop? Or is there something wrong because I'm feeling so much sadness? I just would be grieving and grieving and grieving, like sobbing, wailing sometimes in a lot of my sessions because it needed to be released. I had so much of that. Like I was saying, our societies don't really, we know about epigenetics now, but I think still in terms of the way that emotion gets passed down, the way sensitive people absorb emotions around them, the way that we can be carrying things in from our soul from other lifetimes, take it or leave it if you don't believe in that. But that all can be, held in the body, and having a tool that supports us in processing that in a way where we're not just getting lost in it. If we're just sitting in our apartments, just like sobbing, you just kind of get stuck in that sadness. But using the breath allows, again, the heart to open. So we're like clearing out the grief, but our hearts are opening. So we're feeling that love for ourselves, which is anchoring us to life in a different way.
Yes, absolutely. And everything changes from there. I really haven't met anyone who hasn't struggled with self-worth and self-love in some respect. We think, I don't know, sometimes I get the impression that we think we're on our own in that respect, but we are so not. Everyone is struggling with this in some way. And often the people who seem the most sure of themselves are the people who have it the least. And I can totally attest that with having like a narcissistic ex-partner, absolute suffering from lack of self-love and lack of love from others. And that manifests as a really strong egoic reaction, never falling into victimhood, making sure that there's dominance and superiority. But really, there's just that little boy in this case inside that didn't get what he needed when he was younger.
Yeah. So much of, the pain that's caused in the world is from people who are in pain themselves. Of course, we all know that hurt people, but it really is true.
Yes. Well, I am definitely sold on breathwork, and, I maintain that it's free, it's natural. I mean, of course, you can work with a practitioner, and I do see the benefit of that, especially when you're met with these big feelings. For somebody to hold you in a safe space, that's crucial. But of course, it's natural. We're not pumping ourselves with drugs. We're not taking a pill to make the pain go away. And that is quite special.
Yeah.
I'm going to move into the final fast few questions now, Michelle. And I wanted to ask you first, is there something that you used to believe that you no longer believe?
I think there's probably a lot of things that I used to believe that I don't believe anymore. But I think probably even the framework of having beliefs has shifted for me. I used to be somebody who was like very focused on ideology and the idealism of like what is the best way to live, or the best way to solve certain problems, and then like hearing about things and sort of latching onto those beliefs and holding on to them. And what I've learned on my journey is that, the more tightly I've held on to beliefs, I've typically been not able to see something else. The more I heal, the more my consciousness expands, and I'm able to see and understand more. So it's a little bit more about, for me, resonance. It's like when I feel into something and it feels right for me, then I'll be aligned with it, and it may not last that long, maybe in resonance for a period of time, and then I move on to something else. But yeah, the idea of like, having kind of rigid beliefs, there's probably been tons of things that I believed in the past, but rather than like having this idea or this belief and then swapping it out for another one, it's sort of like my perspective has shifted, and I'm more interested in leaning more and more into understanding why people are the way that they are and living from a heart-centered place.
Yeah, I love that. And it really is an important part to let go of beliefs. And going back to what you said before about, hurt people, hurting people, I think there is also a lot of drama that is caused in the world and across different systems through holding on to a righteousness and a belief that there is one right way and they are the people who know it. And I think as much as we can let go of that and open ourselves to a more compassionate, tolerant perspective, the more we will have a harmonious world and a harmonious inner world as well.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah.
Second, what is one quote or affirmation that resonates with you that you'd like to share?
I think probably my all-time favorite is Ram Dass's "We're all just walking each other home." It feels just like so perfect for the times too, like we're all on this journey together. A lot of times, with all that's going on in the world, we can get so caught up in, again, like you were saying, the right and the wrong. And it's like when we feel into it from a spiritual perspective, like we're all doing the best we can. We're all in this together and we're all walking each other home.
Love it. Third, what is a closing message that you would like to share for people who are on this healing and self-development journey?
I think that, I've been thinking lately about how, looking back at my life, that my life has often not been what I think I want it to be. And I think probably a lot of people, if you're in the painful place in your life, it can feel really frustrating. And I think a lot of times the stuckness can be because we're trying to go one way and really we're being directed another way. And when I've been in, some of the most challenging times for me, I've learned, and now I try to remember that when that's happening, it's sort of like the universe redirecting me, being like, not that way, go this way. And so, like, the more willing we are to let our lives teach us what we're here to learn, and to surrender to whatever we're experiencing, there's some juiciness in it. There's some wisdom in it. And the more we can lean into it and accept it rather than fighting it and pushing it away, I have found the richer my life has become.
That is a beautiful message to finish with. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you for sharing your story and some tips on breath work. And yes, it's been great.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.